Richard Thornfield stood at the tall window of his office on the 50th floor. The city spread out below him like a map made of tiny lights and moving cars. At 42 years old, he owned one of the biggest technology companies in the world. His bank account had more money than most people could count in their lifetime. Yet as he looked down at the busy streets, he felt completely alone. The office around him cost more than most people's houses. The desk was made from wood that came from trees hundreds of years old. The chairs were covered in leather so soft it felt like clouds. Paintings worth millions of dollars hung on the walls. But none of these expensive things made Richard feel happy or complete. His phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up and saw a text message from his ex-wife Sarah. "Marcus has a school play next Friday at 3 p.m. Can you make it this time?" Richard stared at the message for a long moment. His 8-year-old son Marcus lived with Sarah most of the time. Richard got to see him every other weekend and some holidays, but even those visits felt strange and uncomfortable. Richard typed back quickly, "I have a board meeting that day. Maybe next time." He sent the message and immediately felt guilty. This was the third school event he had missed this month, but his company needed him. At least that's what he told himself. He walked back to his desk and sat in his expensive chair. Photos of Marcus sat in silver frames, but they were mostly professional pictures taken by photographers Richard had hired. In the photos, Marcus smiled, but his eyes looked sad. Richard picked up one photo and studied his son's face. When was the last time they had really talked? When was the last time Marcus had laughed and meant it? The truth was, Richard didn't know how to be a good father. He had grown up with parents who were always busy making money. They had given him everything he wanted but never spent time with him. Now he was doing the same thing to Marcus. He bought his son expensive toys, video games, and clothes, but he never just sat with him and listened to what Marcus was thinking about. Richard's assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Thornfield, your dinner meeting with the Japanese investors is in 1 hour," she said through the door. "Thank you, Jennifer," Richard called back. Another business dinner, another night of talking about money and deals while eating food that cost more than many families spent on groceries in a month. He would smile and shake hands and make more money. But he would go home to his empty penthouse apartment and eat breakfast alone the next morning. His penthouse was on the top floor of the tallest building in the city. It had 12 rooms, but Richard only used 3 of them. The kitchen was full of fancy equipment he never touched because he always ordered food from expensive restaurants. The living room had furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Everything was perfect and clean and cold. On weekends, when Marcus visited, the boy would walk around the big apartment like he was in a strange museum. He would sit carefully on the expensive furniture, afraid to make it dirty. They would order pizza and watch movies, but they rarely talked about anything important. Marcus would ask questions about school or his friends, and Richard would give short answers while checking his phone for work emails. Richard often wondered what his life would have been like if he had made different choices. He and Sarah had been happy once when they were young and had less money. They used to walk in the park and talk for hours. They used to laugh together and dream about their future. But as Richard's company grew bigger and bigger, he spent less and less time at home. Sarah had tried to tell him that money wasn't everything, but Richard didn't listen. He thought that if he just made enough money, everyone would be happy. Now Sarah lived in a nice house across town with Marcus. She had remarried a teacher named David, who coached Marcus's little league team and helped him with homework. Richard paid for Marcus's private school and all his activities, but David was the one who showed up to watch Marcus play baseball. David was the one who read bedtime stories and helped Marcus build model airplanes. The sun was setting outside Richard's office window. The sky turned orange and pink and the city lights began to twinkle. It was beautiful, but Richard felt too tired to enjoy it. He had meetings scheduled until 9 o'clock tonight. Then he would go home and eat dinner alone while reading reports on his tablet. Sometimes Richard thought about calling Marcus just to say hello, but he never knew what to talk about. What did 8-year-old boys like these days? What made them laugh? What worried them at night? Richard realized he didn't know his own son very well, and that scared him more than any business problem he had ever faced. His phone rang, breaking the silence. It was another business call about a deal in Europe. Richard answered and started talking about numbers and contracts. But while he talked, he kept looking at the photo of Marcus on his desk. His son's sad eyes seemed to be asking him a question, but Richard didn't know what the question was or how to answer it. As night fell over the city, Richard made a decision. This weekend, when Marcus came to visit, he would try harder. He would put away his phone and really listen to his son. Maybe they could do something fun together, something that didn't cost a lot of money but would help them feel closer to each other. Richard didn't know it yet, but this weekend would change everything. A simple trip to the park would teach him lessons that all his money and success had never taught him. He would learn that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought with credit cards or bank transfers. And he would learn that his 8-year-old son was much wiser than he had ever imagined. For now, though, Richard finished his business call and prepared for another evening of expensive food and empty conversations. The city sparkled below him, full of people living their lives while he sat alone in his golden cage 50 floors above the world. Saturday morning came with bright sunshine streaming through the tall windows of Richard's penthouse. He had woken up early, which was unusual for a weekend. Usually he slept late and spent Saturday morning reading business news on his tablet, while drinking expensive coffee. But today was different. Today Marcus was coming to visit. Richard stood in his kitchen, looking at the fancy coffee machine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He didn't know how to use it properly. His housekeeper usually made his coffee during the week. He pressed a few buttons and managed to make a cup that tasted bitter and too strong. As he drank it, he thought about what he and Marcus could do together. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock. Richard opened the door and saw Marcus standing there with a small backpack. His son looked up at him with those same sad eyes from the photographs. Sarah stood behind Marcus and she looked tired. "Hi, Dad," Marcus said quietly. His voice was polite but not excited. "Hello, Marcus," Richard replied. He wanted to hug his son, but something always made him hesitate. Instead, he patted Marcus on the shoulder. "Did you have a good week at school?" "It was okay," Marcus answered. He walked into the big apartment and set his backpack down carefully. Sarah gave Richard a look that said many things without words. She was worried about Marcus. The boy had been quieter than usual lately, and she hoped that spending time with his father might help. "I'll pick him up tomorrow at 6, Sarah said. "Try to spend some real time with him, Richard. No work calls, okay?" Richard nodded. "Of course. We'll have fun." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure what fun meant for an 8-year-old boy. After Sarah left, Richard and Marcus stood in the living room looking at each other. The apartment felt even bigger and emptier with the small boy in it. Marcus sat on the edge of the expensive couch, his feet not quite touching the floor. "So," Richard said, sitting down next to his son, "what would you like to do today?" Marcus shrugged. "I don't know. What do you want to do?" This was how their conversations always went. Neither of them knew what the other person liked or wanted. Richard thought about suggesting a movie, but they had watched movies during Marcus's last few visits. Maybe they could play video games, but Marcus didn't seem very interested in the expensive gaming system Richard had bought him. "How about we go outside?" Richard suggested. "Maybe to the park?" Marcus looked surprised. His father never suggested going outside. Usually they stayed in the apartment or went to expensive restaurants where Marcus had to sit still and be quiet. "Really?" Marcus asked. "To the park with the playground?" "Sure," Richard said. "Why not?" Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. "Okay, can I bring my baseball?" Richard looked around the apartment. He didn't remember Marcus having a baseball here. "Do you have one here?" "No," Marcus said, "but David gave me one to keep at Mom's house. I forgot to bring it." David, the stepfather who seemed to know exactly what Marcus needed. Richard felt a familiar pang of jealousy mixed with guilt. "That's okay. Maybe we can get one on the way." They got ready to leave, and Richard realized he wasn't sure which park to go to. He knew there were parks in the city, but he had never paid attention to them. He asked Marcus if he had a favorite park. "There's one with a really big playground near Mom's house," Marcus said. "It has swings and a sandbox and a place to play baseball." Richard called his driver, but then he stopped. Maybe they should walk. It was a nice day, and walking might give them time to talk. He had never walked to a park before. He wasn't even sure he owned the right shoes for walking in a park. "Actually," Richard said, "let's take the subway. That might be fun." Marcus's eyes got wide. "You want to ride the subway? But you always say the subway is dirty and crowded." Richard realized his son was right. He had said those things. But maybe dirty and crowded wasn't always bad. Maybe it was just different from what he was used to. They walked to the subway station together. Richard felt strange wearing jeans and sneakers instead of his usual expensive suits. People on the street didn't stare at him or recognize him. He was just another father walking with his son on a Saturday morning. On the subway, Marcus pressed his face to the window and watched the city go by. He pointed out interesting things he saw. A man walking 3 dogs at once, a woman painting a mural on the side of a building, kids playing soccer in a small park. "Dad," Marcus said as they rode along, "why don't we do this more often?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the chest. Do what? Just go places together, without your phone and without meetings and stuff. Richard didn't have a good answer. The truth was, he had never thought about it. His own father had never done things like this with him. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But maybe we should do it more." When they got to the park, Richard was amazed by how big and green it was. There were trees everywhere, and families having picnics on blankets. Children ran around laughing and playing games. It was loud and messy and full of life. It was nothing like the quiet, clean world of his penthouse. Marcus ran toward the playground and Richard followed more slowly. He sat on a bench and watched his son climb on the jungle gym. Marcus moved carefully at first, like he was afraid of getting dirty. But soon he was laughing and playing with other children who were there. Richard pulled out his phone to check his emails, but then he stopped. Sarah had asked him not to work today, and watching Marcus play was actually more interesting than reading about quarterly reports. His son was talking to a girl about his age who was also on the playground. They were laughing about something, and Marcus looked happy in a way Richard rarely saw. After about an hour, Marcus ran back to the bench. His hair was messy and his clothes were a little dirty, but he was smiling. "Dad, I'm getting hungry," he said. "Can we get something to eat?" Richard looked around the park. He saw a hot dog cart near the entrance, but he also saw families eating sandwiches and snacks they had brought from home. He realized he hadn't thought to bring any food. "Let's go find something," Richard said. They started walking toward the other side of the park where Marcus had seen some food trucks. But as they walked, Marcus suddenly stopped. "Dad, look," Marcus said, pointing toward a big oak tree. "There's a girl sitting all by herself." Richard looked where his son was pointing. Under the tree, a girl about Marcus's age sat alone. She had long, dark hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in a while. Her clothes were too big for her and had holes in them. She was holding something small in her hands. "She looked sad," Marcus said, "and hungry." Richard felt uncomfortable. He wasn't used to seeing poverty up close. In his world, everyone was clean and well-dressed and successful. But Marcus was already walking toward the girl, and Richard had to follow. The girl under the oak tree was named Elena, though Richard and Marcus didn't know that yet. She was 9 years old, just 1 year older than Marcus, but her eyes looked much older than her age. She had been sitting under the tree for almost an hour, watching other families enjoy their picnics and play games together. Elena held a small sandwich wrapped in brown paper. The paper was old and wrinkled like it had been used many times before. The sandwich was made of white bread with peanut butter, and it was all the food she had for the entire day. Her mother had made it early that morning before leaving for her first job. Elena's mother worked 3 different jobs, but they still didn't have enough money for everything they needed. The girls' clothes were too big because they came from the donation box at the homeless shelter, where she and her mother stayed. Her shoes had holes near the toes and she had tried to cover the holes with tape, but the tape was starting to come off. Her hair was tangled because the shelter only had cold water for showers, and there wasn't always soap. Elena watched the other children playing on the playground with their parents. She saw fathers pushing children on swings and mothers helping kids climb up slides. She remembered when her own father used to do those things with her, before he got sick and went to heaven. That was 2 years ago, when Elena was 7. Since then it had been just Elena and her mother, and life had become very hard. At night, Elena and her mother slept in a small room at the shelter with 2 beds and 1 tiny window. During the day, Elena's mother worked at a cleaning company, then at a grocery store, then at a restaurant washing dishes. Elena usually stayed at the shelter's daycare program, but today was Saturday, and the daycare was closed. So Elena had come to the park by herself to have some fresh air and watch the trees. The shelter was not a bad place, but it wasn't home. Elena missed having her own room with her own toys and books. She missed having a kitchen where her mother could cook dinner every night. She missed having enough food in the refrigerator and not having to worry about whether there would be breakfast tomorrow. Elena's little brother Miguel was at the shelter today. He was only 4 years old and often got sick. Yesterday he had started coughing and running a fever. Elena's mother had taken him to the free clinic, but the medicine cost money they didn't have. That's why Elena's mother had to work extra hours this weekend, and why Elena was sitting alone in the park with only 1 small sandwich. As Elena unwrapped her sandwich, she tried to eat it slowly to make it last longer. She had learned that if you ate very small bites and chewed them for a long time, your stomach would feel full for a little while. She broke off a tiny piece of the sandwich and put it in her mouth, closing her eyes to enjoy the taste of peanut butter. She was so focused on her small meal that she didn't notice Marcus walking toward her until he was standing right in front of the tree. Elena looked up and saw a boy with clean clothes and neat hair. Behind him stood a tall man in expensive-looking jeans and sneakers. Elena had gotten good at telling which people had money and which people didn't. These two definitely had money. "Hi," Marcus said in a friendly voice. "I'm Marcus. What's your name?" Elena hesitated. Sometimes when she talked to kids who had money, they were mean to her because of her clothes or because she smelled like the shelter soap. But Marcus seemed nice, and his smile looked real. "I'm Elena," she said quietly. "Are you here by yourself?" Marcus asked. "Where are your parents?" Elena looked down at her sandwich. This was always the hard question. She didn't like to lie, but she also didn't like to tell people that she lived in a shelter. Some people felt sorry for her and some people acted like being homeless was her fault. "My mom is working," Elena said. "She works a lot." Marcus nodded like he understood. "My dad works a lot too, but today he's spending time with me. We're going to get some food. Are you hungry?" Elena looked at her small sandwich and then at Marcus. She was very hungry. 1 sandwich wasn't enough food for a whole day, especially when she hadn't eaten anything for breakfast. But she couldn't ask these strangers for food. "I have this sandwich," Elena said, showing Marcus the wrapped food in her hands. Marcus looked at the sandwich and then at his father. Richard was standing a few feet away, watching the conversation with an uncomfortable expression on his face. He had never been this close to someone who was obviously poor, and he didn't know what to say or do. "That looks like a good sandwich," Marcus said to Elena. "But it's kind of small. Don't you want something else too?" Elena shrugged. This is enough, but Marcus could see that it wasn't enough. The sandwich was very small and Elena looked thin. Her face was a little pale, and her eyes had dark circles under them like she was tired all the time. "Dad," Marcus called to Richard, "can we get Elena some food too?" Richard walked closer to them. Up close he could see that Elena's clothes were old and worn. Her shoes were held together with tape. She looked like she needed much more than just food. She needed new clothes and shoes and probably a lot of other things. "Hello, Elena," Richard said awkwardly. "It's nice to meet you." Elena looked up at the tall man. He seemed nervous, like he didn't know how to talk to her. That was okay. Most rich people didn't know how to talk to homeless people, but he didn't seem mean, and his son was being very kind. "Hello," Elena said politely. Her mother had taught her to always be polite even when people weren't nice to her. "Are you here with anyone?" Richard asked. "Is someone taking care of you?" "I can take care of myself," Elena said with a little pride in her voice. "I'm 9 years old. I know how to be safe in the park." Marcus sat down on the ground next to Elena, not caring that his clean clothes might get dirty. "Do you come to this park a lot?" "Sometimes," Elena said, "when the daycare at the shelter is closed." "Shelter?" Marcus asked. He didn't understand what that meant. Elena realized she had said too much. Now they would know she was homeless. She waited for them to make excuses and walk away, like some people did when they found out where she lived. But Marcus just looked confused, not mean. "What's a shelter?" Elena looked at Richard and then back at Marcus. "It's a place where people stay when they don't have a house," she explained. "My mom and I live there until we can save enough money for our own apartment." Marcus's eyes got wide. He had never met anyone who didn't have a house. "You don't have a house?" "Not right now," Elena said. "But my mom says we will someday. She's working really hard to save money." Richard felt something strange happening in his chest. It was like a tight feeling that made it hard to breathe. This little girl who was younger than Marcus was living in a homeless shelter. She was sitting alone in a park with one small sandwich while his son had everything he could ever want. "Elena," Marcus said, "would you like to eat lunch with us? My dad was going to buy us food from one of those trucks over there." Elena looked at her sandwich again. She wanted to say yes, but she also didn't want these nice people to feel like they had to take care of her. "I don't have any money," she said honestly. "That's okay," Marcus said quickly. "My dad has lots of money, don't you, Dad?" Richard looked down at his son and then at Elena. The little girl was watching him with hopeful eyes, but she was trying not to look too excited in case he said no. "Of course," Richard said. "We would be happy to have you join us for lunch." Elena's face lit up with the first real smile she had smiled in days. "Really? You don't mind?" "We don't mind at all," Marcus said. "Come on, let's go see what kind of food they have." Elena carefully wrapped up her sandwich and put it in her pocket. She would save it for dinner tonight. Then she stood up and brushed the dirt off her clothes. As the three of them walked toward the food trucks, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the happiness of having friends to eat with. The food trucks were lined up along the edge of the park like a colorful parade. There was a truck that sold tacos, another that made fresh sandwiches, one with pizza, and another with hot dogs and hamburgers. The smell of grilling meat and fresh bread filled the air, and Elena's stomach made a small rumbling sound. Marcus looked at all the choices with excitement. At home he usually ate whatever the housekeeper prepared or whatever expensive restaurant his father ordered from. But this was different. This was like an adventure. "What looks good to you, Elena?" Marcus asked. Elena stared at all the food trucks with wide eyes. She had walked past them before, but she had never been able to buy anything from them. Everything smelled so good, and there were so many choices, she didn't know what to say. "I don't know," she said softly. "What do you like?" "I like hamburgers," Marcus said. "And French fries. Do you like hamburgers?" Elena nodded. She liked hamburgers, very much, but she hadn't had one in a long time. At the shelter, they usually served simple food like soup and bread, or sometimes spaghetti. The food was okay, but it wasn't special like the food from these trucks. Richard watched the two children look at the menus posted on the sides of the trucks. He felt strange standing there in his expensive sneakers, thinking about how much money was in his wallet compared to how much food Elena probably got to eat in a normal day. They walked up to the burger truck, and Richard read the menu. The prices were very reasonable, much less than he usually spent on lunch at fancy restaurants. But he realized that for Elena's family, even these small prices were probably too much. "What would you like, Elena?" Richard asked. Elena looked at the menu board, but she had trouble reading some of the words. She had missed a lot of school days when her family first became homeless, and she was still catching up on her reading. "Could I have a hamburger, please?" she asked quietly. "Just a small one." "How about a cheeseburger?" Marcus suggested. "With French fries? Dad, can she get French fries too?" Richard nodded. Of course. Elena, would you like anything to drink? Elena couldn't believe this was really happening. These kind people were going to buy her a whole meal, a cheeseburger, French fries, and a drink. It was more food than she usually got in a whole day. Could I have lemonade? She asked. I really like lemonade. 3 cheeseburgers, 3 orders of fries, and 3 lemonades, Richard told the man in the food truck. While they waited for their food, Marcus and Elena sat at a picnic table nearby. Richard stood next to them, listening to their conversation. Do you go to school? Marcus asked Elena. Yes, Elena said. I go to Washington Elementary, but sometimes I have to miss days when my mom needs me to watch my little brother. You have a brother? Marcus asked with interest. How old is he? He's 4, Elena said. His name is Miguel. He's sick right now, so my mom had to work extra to pay for his medicine. Marcus thought about this. He didn't have any brothers or sisters, and he sometimes felt lonely. But he also didn't have to worry about anyone being sick or needing medicine. Is he going to be okay? Marcus asked. I think so, Elena said. But medicine costs a lot of money and we don't have very much. Richard listened to this conversation with growing discomfort. Here was a little girl who was worried about her brother's medical bills while Richard spent more money on coffee in a week than this family probably had for food. Their order was ready, and Richard brought the food to the table. The cheeseburgers were big and juicy, the French fries were golden and crispy, and the lemonade was cold and sweet. Elena looked at her meal like it was the most wonderful thing she had ever seen. Thank you so much, she said to Richard. This is really nice of you. You're welcome, Richard said, sitting down at the table with them. Marcus picked up his cheeseburger and took a big bite. Elena picked up hers more carefully, like she wanted to make sure she didn't waste any of it. She ate slowly, enjoying every bite. This is the best cheeseburger I've ever had, Elena said with a smile. Marcus grinned. It is pretty good. Do you want some of my fries? I got a lot. That's okay, Elena said. You should eat your own food. But Marcus was already pushing some of his fries toward Elena's side of the table. I always get too much food anyway. My dad says I should share with people. Richard looked at his son with surprise. When had he ever told Marcus to share with people? Richard realized that Marcus was naturally kind in a way that Richard had forgotten how to be. They ate and talked, and Richard found himself actually enjoying the conversation. Elena was smart and funny, and she made Marcus laugh in a way that Richard rarely saw. She told them about the other kids at the shelter and about her favorite teacher at school. She talked about how much she missed having a pet. They had owned a cat before they became homeless, but they had to give it away because pets weren't allowed at the shelter. When they finished eating, Elena carefully wrapped up the last 2 bites of her cheeseburger in a napkin. Are you not hungry anymore? Marcus asked. I'm saving it, Elena explained. For later. Richard understood. She was saving it for dinner because this might be all the food she would get today. Elena, Marcus said, would you like another cheeseburger to take with you? Elena's eyes got wide. Oh no, that's too much. You've already been so nice to me. Dad, Marcus said, turning to Richard, can we get Elena another cheeseburger? And maybe one for her brother too, since he's sick? Richard looked at his son and felt something shift inside his chest. Marcus wasn't just thinking about Elena. He was thinking about her sick little brother, whom he had never even met. Of course, Richard said. Elena, would you like us to get some food for your family? Elena's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. Really? You would do that? We would be happy to, Richard said. And he meant it. They went back to the food truck and ordered more food. Richard bought cheeseburgers and fries for Elena's mother and brother, plus some extra sandwiches and fruit. As he paid for everything, he realized he was spending less money than he usually spent on one fancy coffee. But then something happened that Richard would never forget. As they were getting ready to leave the picnic table, Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out the small peanut butter sandwich she had been eating when they first met her. Marcus, she said, holding out the sandwich, would you like half of this? You've been so nice to me and I want to share something with you too. Marcus looked at the small wrinkled sandwich. He had just eaten a big cheeseburger and fries. He wasn't hungry at all. The sandwich looked plain and simple compared to the meal they had just shared. But Elena was offering it with such a big smile and such hope in her eyes that Marcus understood something important. This wasn't about the food. This was about sharing and friendship. Thank you, Elena, Marcus said, taking half of the small sandwich. That's really nice of you. Elena beamed with happiness. My mom always says that sharing makes food taste better. Richard watched his son take a bite of the simple peanut butter sandwich and smile like it was the most delicious thing he had ever eaten. And in that moment, Richard felt his heart crack open in a way it hadn't in years. Here was a little girl who had almost nothing, and she wanted to share what little she had with someone who had just shown her kindness. All his life, Richard had been surrounded by people who wanted things from him: money, favors, business deals. But Elena just wanted to give something back, even though she had almost nothing to give. As they walked through the park together, Richard realized that his son had just taught him something about generosity that all his business school education had never covered. And a homeless 9-year-old girl had shown him what real wealth looked like. Richard stood quietly watching as Marcus and Elena shared the simple peanut butter sandwich. Something was happening inside him that he had never experienced before. It was like waking up from a long dream and suddenly seeing the world clearly, for the first time. In his business life, Richard was used to complex deals worth millions of dollars. He made decisions about buying and selling companies, about hiring and firing hundreds of people, about investments that could change entire industries. But watching Elena offer half of her tiny sandwich to his son was more powerful than any business deal he had ever seen. Elena had almost nothing. She lived in a homeless shelter, wore clothes with holes in them, and had been sitting alone in the park with one small sandwich as her only meal for the day. But when someone showed her kindness, her first thought was to give something back. She didn't think about keeping everything for herself. She didn't worry about whether she would have enough food later. She just wanted to share. Richard thought about the people in his own life. His business partners, his employees, even his friends at expensive restaurants and charity events. When was the last time someone had offered him something without wanting, something bigger in return? When was the last time someone had been generous with him just because they wanted to be kind? Dad, Marcus said, interrupting Richard's thoughts. Elena was telling me about where she lives. Can we see it? Richard felt uncomfortable again. He had never been to a homeless shelter. He had written checks to charities that helped homeless people, but he had never actually met any homeless people or seen where they lived. I don't know if that's a good idea, Richard said carefully. Why not? Marcus asked. Elena says there are other kids there. Maybe we could meet them too. Elena looked up at Richard with hopeful eyes. The shelter's really close to here. It's just a few blocks away. My mom should be back from work soon and I know she would like to meet you. She always taught me to say thank you to people who are kind to us. Richard realized that Elena wanted to introduce them to her mother. She was proud of the new friends she had made and she wanted to share that happiness with her family. How could he say no to that? Okay, Richard said. We can walk with you to the shelter. As they walked through the city streets, Richard saw things he had never noticed before. They passed several people sitting on sidewalks with signs asking for help. Richard had driven past these people thousands of times in his expensive car, but he had never really looked at them. Now he saw that they were real people with real faces and real problems. Elena walked between Marcus and Richard, carrying the bag of food they had bought for her family. She pointed out different places as they walked: the free clinic where she took her brother when he was sick, the library where she liked to read books when the shelter was too noisy, the school where she was trying to catch up on the classes she had missed. Do you like school? Marcus asked. I love school, Elena said with enthusiasm. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, is really nice. She helped me learn to read better after we moved to the shelter. Sometimes I had to miss school to take care of Miguel when he was sick, so I got behind in my reading. What's your favorite subject? Marcus asked. Math, Elena said with a smile. I'm really good at math. Mrs. Rodriguez says I might be able to skip ahead to the next grade level in math if I keep working hard. Richard listened to this conversation and felt ashamed. Elena was excited about possibly skipping one grade level in math. Meanwhile, Richard had paid for Marcus to attend the most expensive private school in the city, with small class sizes and every possible advantage. Marcus had tutors and special programs and every educational opportunity money could buy, but he had never heard his son talk about school with the enthusiasm that Elena showed. The shelter was a large old building that looked like it might have been a school or community center many years ago. It was clean but old, with paint peeling off some of the walls. There were several families sitting outside on the front steps, including some children playing with simple toys. "This is where I live," Elena said, pointing to the building. "It's not bad. Everyone here is nice, and the people who work here try to help us." Richard looked at the building and tried to imagine living there with Marcus. He thought about his 12-room penthouse with its expensive furniture and amazing view of the city. Then he thought about Elena sharing a small room with her mother and brother, with no privacy and no space to call her own. "Elena," a voice called from the front steps. A woman was walking toward them with a big smile on her face. She was thin and looked tired, but her eyes were warm and kind. "I was wondering where you were. Mama." Elena ran to the woman and hugged her tightly. "These are my new friends, Marcus and his dad, Mr. Richard. They bought me lunch and food for you and Miguel, too." Elena's mother looked at Richard and Marcus with surprise and gratitude. She was wearing a uniform from a cleaning company, and her hands looked rough from working hard. "Thank you so much," she said to Richard. "Elena told me she met some nice people at the park, but I didn't expect—" "This is very kind of you. It was our pleasure," Richard said, and he was surprised to realize he meant it. "Elena is a wonderful girl. You should be very proud of her." Elena's mother smiled with pride. "She is my sunshine. Even when things are hard, she always finds ways to be happy and help other people." "How is Miguel?" Elena asked her mother. "He's feeling a little better today," her mother said. "The medicine is helping, but he's still resting upstairs." Richard thought about the medicine that cost money this family didn't have. He thought about his son, who had never had to worry about whether there would be money for medicine when he was sick. Mrs. Richard realized he didn't know Elena's last name. "Rodriguez," Elena's mother said. "Maria Rodriguez." "Mrs. Rodriguez, would it be okay if we visited sometimes? Marcus really enjoyed meeting Elena, and I think they could be good friends." Elena's eyes lit up. "Really? You want to be friends with me?" "Of course," Marcus said. "You're the nicest person I've met in a long time." Richard felt another crack in his heart. When was the last time Marcus had met someone new and made a real friend? Most of the children Marcus knew were from his expensive private school, and their relationships seemed formal and arranged by parents for social reasons. "You would be welcome anytime," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Elena doesn't have many friends her age. Most of the kids here are either much younger or much older than her." As they talked, Richard learned more about Elena's family. Mrs. Rodriguez had been a teacher before her husband died and they lost their house. She was working 3 jobs now, trying to save money for an apartment. But it was hard because childcare was expensive and Miguel got sick often. "I'm hoping to go back to teaching soon," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "But I need to find stable housing first, and I need to make sure Miguel is healthy." Richard found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask before. How long had they been at the shelter? What did they need most? What were their biggest challenges? As the sun began to set, Richard realized they had been talking for over an hour. Marcus and Elena were sitting on the steps with some other children, sharing the extra food they had bought. Marcus was laughing and playing games with kids he had just met, and he looked happier than Richard had seen him in months. "We should probably go," Richard finally said, "but we would really like to see you again soon." "Thank you again for everything," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "You have made Elena very happy today, and that makes me happy too." As they walked back toward the subway station, Marcus was quiet for a while. Finally, he looked up at his father. "Dad," he said, "why do some people have so much money and other people don't have enough?" Richard stopped walking. This was one of the hardest questions his son had ever asked him, and he didn't have a good answer. That's a very complicated question. Marcus, Richard said, there are many reasons why some people have more than others, but Elena is just as smart as me, Marcus said. And she's really nice. Why doesn't she get to live in a big apartment like we do? Richard looked down at his son and realized that Marcus was thinking about things that Richard had never considered. At his age, Marcus was developing a sense of fairness and justice that Richard wasn't sure he had ever had. You're right, Richard said. Elena is very smart and very nice, and you're asking a really important question. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed in Richard's guest room, Richard sat in his living room looking out at the city lights. He thought about Elena sharing her sandwich, about Mrs. Rodriguez working 3 jobs to try to provide for her children, about the other families they had met at the shelter. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he had learned something important. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if having all this money meant that he had a responsibility to do something more meaningful with it than just making more money. The next morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual. He had barely slept all night thinking about Elena and her family. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of the little girl offering half of her tiny sandwich to his son. He kept thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez working 3 jobs just to pay for medicine for her sick child. Marcus was already awake, sitting at the breakfast table and eating cereal. Usually, Marcus ate breakfast quietly while Richard read business news on his tablet, but this morning was different. Dad, Marcus said as soon as Richard sat down, I keep thinking about Elena and Miguel. Do you think Miguel is feeling better today? Richard poured himself coffee and looked at his son. I hope so. His mother said the medicine was helping. But what if they don't have enough money for more medicine? Marcus asked. What happens then? Richard had been wondering the same thing. In his world, if someone needed medicine, they just bought it. The price didn't matter. But for Elena's family, the cost of medicine meant choosing between medication and food. I don't know, Richard said honestly. I think there are programs that help people who can't afford medicine. But Elena's mom is already working 3 jobs, Marcus pointed out. When does she have time to find those programs? And who takes care of Elena and Miguel while she's working? Richard was amazed by his son's questions. Marcus was thinking about problems that Richard had never considered, even though Richard donated money to charities every year for tax reasons. Dad, Marcus continued, why don't we have these problems? Why do we have so much money that we don't even think about it? Richard set down his coffee cup. This was one of the hardest conversations he had ever had to have with his son. Well, Richard said slowly, I started a company that became very successful. We created technology that many people wanted to buy, so the company made a lot of money. But Elena's mom was a teacher, Marcus said. Teaching is important too. Why didn't she make a lot of money? Richard thought about this. He had never really considered why some jobs paid more than others or whether that was fair. Teachers are very important, Richard agreed. But sometimes jobs that are important to society don't pay as much money as other jobs. That doesn't seem fair, Marcus said. Elena's mom helps kids learn, and that's really important. She should have enough money to take care of her own kids. Richard realized that his 8-year-old son understood something about fairness that many adults never figured out. Marcus could see clearly that there was something wrong with a world where a teacher couldn't afford medicine for her sick child, while other people had more money than they could ever spend. You're right, Richard said. It doesn't seem fair. They finished breakfast in thoughtful silence. Richard found himself looking around his expensive apartment and seeing it differently. The kitchen had fancy appliances that he never used. The living room had furniture that cost more than most people made in a year. The guest bathroom had towels that cost more than Elena's family probably spent on food in a week. Later that morning, Richard tried to work on some business documents, but he couldn't concentrate. He kept thinking about the other families they had met at the shelter. He remembered a mother with 2 small children and an older man who had lost his job and couldn't find a new one. He thought about all those children who were living in one building while he and Marcus lived alone in 12 rooms. "Dad," Marcus said, coming into Richard's office, "can we go visit Elena today?" Richard looked up from his computer. "Today? But you're supposed to go back to your mother's house this afternoon. Can't we visit Elena first? I want to see if Miguel is feeling better, and I want to bring them something." "Bring them something?" Richard asked. "What do you want to bring?" Marcus thought about this seriously. "Well, Elena said Miguel likes to draw, but they don't have crayons or coloring books at the shelter. And Elena said she likes to read, but there aren't many books there that are right for her age." Richard was surprised. When had Elena mentioned these things? He realized that while he had been focused on the big picture of their homelessness, Marcus had been paying attention to the small details that would make Elena and Miguel happy. "Those are good ideas," Richard said. "We could stop at a store on the way." They went to a large toy store that Richard had never been to before. Usually, when he bought gifts for Marcus, he just told his assistant to order something expensive online. But walking through the store with Marcus was different. Marcus carefully looked at art supplies and books, thinking about what Elena and Miguel would like. "This coloring book has animals," Marcus said, holding up a book. "Elena said Miguel likes animals, and these crayons have a lot of colors." Richard watched his son choose gifts thoughtfully and carefully. Marcus wasn't just grabbing the most expensive things. He was thinking about what would make his new friends happy. They also bought some books for Elena. Marcus chose books that were at the right reading level for a 9-year-old, and he made sure to get stories that had happy endings. "Elena has enough sad things in her life," Marcus explained. "She should get to read happy stories." When they arrived at the shelter, they found Elena sitting outside with several other children. Her face lit up when she saw Marcus and Richard walking toward them. "You came back," Elena said happily. "I wasn't sure if you would really come back." "Of course we came back," Marcus said. "We brought some things for you and Miguel." Elena's eyes got wide when she saw the bag of gifts. "For us? Really?" Marcus pulled out the coloring books and crayons. "These are for Miguel. Is he feeling better?" "Today? He's much better," Elena said with excitement. "The fever is gone and he's not coughing as much. He's upstairs resting, but I think he would love to meet you." They went inside the shelter, and Richard saw what Elena's living situation really looked like. The room she shared with her mother and brother was very small, with 2 beds and a few personal belongings stored in plastic bags. But it was clean, and Elena had tried to make it homey by drawing pictures and hanging them on the walls. Miguel was a small 4-year-old with big dark eyes like his sister's. He was still a little weak from being sick, but he smiled shyly when Marcus showed him the coloring books. "These are for me?" Miguel asked in a soft voice. "Yes," Marcus said. "Elena told me you like to draw." Miguel's face broke into a huge grin. "I love to draw, but I only had 2 crayons and one of them was broken." Richard watched Miguel carefully examine each crayon in the box, like they were precious treasures. The joy on the little boy's face over something so simple made Richard feel both happy and sad at the same time. Mrs. Rodriguez came upstairs to see what was happening, and she thanked Richard and Marcus again for their kindness. "Elena hasn't stopped talking about you since yesterday," she said. "She keeps saying she has new friends who are nice to her." "We like Elena very much," Richard said, "and Miguel too, they're wonderful children." As they spent time at the shelter, Richard met more of the families who lived there. He learned that many of them were working people who had lost their homes because of medical bills, job layoffs, or other emergencies. They weren't people who had made bad choices. They were people who had run into bad luck and didn't have enough money saved to handle a crisis. One mother told Richard that she worked full-time at a grocery store, but her salary wasn't enough to pay for both rent and daycare for her children. Another family had lost their apartment when the father got hurt at work and couldn't work for 3 months. "I never realized," Richard said to Mrs. Rodriguez, "how quickly someone's life can change." "Most people don't realize," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Before my husband died, I thought homelessness was something that only happened to people who had addiction problems or didn't want to work. I never imagined it could happen to a family like ours." Richard thought about his own life. What would happen to him and Marcus if his company suddenly failed? What would happen if he got sick and couldn't work? He had enough money saved to last for many lifetimes, but most people didn't have that security. That evening, as they rode the subway back to Richard's apartment, Marcus asked more questions. "Dad, how many people live in shelters like Elena's?" Richard realized he didn't know. "I'm not sure, probably quite a few." "And how many people like us live in big apartments with lots of rooms they don't use?" Richard felt uncomfortable. "I don't know that either." "Don't you think that's strange?" Marcus asked. "That some people don't have enough space and other people have too much space?" Richard looked at his son and realized that Marcus was developing a moral compass that Richard wasn't sure he had ever had. His son was seeing inequality and thinking it was wrong, while Richard had spent most of his life just accepting it as the way things were. "Yes," Richard said finally. "I think that is strange." That night, Richard couldn't sleep again. He walked around his huge apartment, counting the rooms he never used and thinking about the families crowded into the shelter. He thought about Elena's willingness to share her tiny sandwich and about how happy Miguel had been to receive a simple box of crayons. For the first time in his adult life, Richard started to wonder if being rich meant that he had responsibilities he had never thought about before. Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself thinking about Elena and her family every day. He couldn't concentrate on his work the way he used to. During important business meetings, he would find his mind wandering to thoughts about Miguel's medicine or whether Elena had enough to eat for lunch. Richard started doing something he had never done before. He began researching homelessness and poverty in his city. He spent hours reading reports and statistics on his computer. He learned that there were over 8,000 homeless people in his city, including 2,000 children. He discovered that many homeless families were headed by people who worked full-time jobs but still couldn't afford housing. The numbers shocked him. Richard spent more money on coffee in a month than many of these families had for all their expenses. His car cost more than most people made in 5 years. His watch cost more than a year's worth of medicine for sick children, like Miguel. Marcus visited Richard every weekend, and every weekend they went to see Elena and her family. Richard started to recognize the other families at the shelter, and he began to learn their stories. There was Janet, a single mother of 3 who worked as a nurse but couldn't afford both rent and daycare. There was Mr. Williams, an older man who had lost his job when his factory closed and hadn't been able to find new work. There was the Chen family, who had lost their house when their son needed expensive medical treatment for cancer. Each story made Richard understand more about how quickly life could change for people who didn't have money saved up for emergencies. These weren't people who were lazy or who had made terrible choices. They were people who had worked hard but ran into problems that they couldn't solve with the money they had. One Saturday, Richard was talking with Mrs. Rodriguez while Marcus and Elena played with Miguel and some other children. The hardest part, Mrs. Rodriguez told him, isn't living in one room or not having our own kitchen. The hardest part is not knowing when it will end. I'm saving money, but housing is so expensive that it will take me months to save enough for a security deposit and first month's rent. How much would you need? Richard asked. Mrs. Rodriguez looked embarrassed. I shouldn't be talking to you about money. You've already been so kind to us. Please, Richard said. I'd like to know. Well, Mrs. Rodriguez said slowly, I've been looking at apartments that would be big enough for the 3 of us. Most of them want first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. That's usually about $4,500 total. Then I would need money for basic furniture and supplies, maybe $6,000 altogether. Richard thought about this number, $6,000. He spent more than that on business dinners in a month. His company made that much money in about 3 minutes. What if someone helped you with that money? Richard asked carefully. Would you be able to manage the monthly rent after that? Oh yes, Mrs. Rodriguez said quickly. I make enough money to pay monthly rent. It's just the upfront costs that I can't afford all at once. Richard nodded thoughtfully. That evening he talked to Marcus about what Mrs. Rodriguez had told him. So Elena's family could move into their own apartment if they had $6,000, Marcus asked. That's what her mother said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Dad, you spend more than that on stuff you don't really need all the time. Richard realized. His son was right. Yes, I do. So why don't we just give them the money? It was such a simple question, but it made Richard think about things in a new way. Why didn't he just give them the money? He had millions of dollars that he didn't need. Elena's family needed $6,000 to change their entire lives. I think that's a very good idea, Richard said, but I want to make sure we do it in a way that helps them and doesn't make them feel bad. Richard had learned that pride was important to people like Mrs. Rodriguez. She didn't want charity that made her feel like she couldn't take care of her family. She wanted help that would let her work toward independence. The next week, Richard did something he had never done before. Instead of sending his assistant to handle his charitable giving, he went personally to visit the director of the homeless shelter. Her name was Ms. Thompson, and she had been running the shelter for 10 years. I want to understand how I can help, Richard told her, not just by writing a check, but by really making a difference. Ms. Thompson was surprised. Most wealthy donors preferred to keep their distance from the actual problems they were funding solutions for. What we need most, Ms. Thompson explained, is help with transitional housing. Most of our families are ready to live independently, but they need help with the upfront costs of getting an apartment. Once they have stable housing, they can usually manage on their own. How many families are in that situation? Richard asked. Right now? About 15 families, maybe 20. Richard did quick math in his head. If each family needed about $6,000 to move into permanent housing, that was only a $120,000 total. Richard made more than that in interest on his investments every few days. What if I funded a program to help all of those families move into apartments? Richard asked. Ms. Thompson's eyes got wide. All of them? That would change everything for these families. But I don't want to just give money and walk away, Richard said. I want to understand what else they need to be successful. Over the next several weeks, Richard spent time learning about the real challenges that homeless families faced. He discovered that finding an apartment was only the first step. Many families also needed help with job training, childcare, and connecting to community resources. Richard met with social workers, city officials, and other families at the shelter. He started to understand that solving homelessness wasn't just about money. It was about creating systems that helped people build stable lives. But money was an important part of it. Richard decided to create a program that would provide not just housing assistance, but also job training, childcare support, and financial counseling. He worked with Ms. Thompson to design a program that would help families become truly independent. The first family to benefit from the program was Elena's family. Richard insisted that they be first, since Elena and Miguel had taught him so much about generosity and resilience. When Mrs. Rodriguez learned that she had been selected for the housing program, she cried, but they were happy tears. I can't believe this is real, she said to Richard. Elena will have her own room. Miguel will have space to play. We'll have a kitchen where I can cook dinner for my children. Richard felt something he had never felt before when he spent money. Usually buying things just made him want to buy more things, but helping Elena's family move into their own apartment made him feel truly happy for the first time in years. There's just one condition, Richard told Mrs. Rodriguez. Elena and Miguel have to promise to stay friends with Marcus and me. Elena, who had been listening to the conversation, threw her arms around Richard's waist. We promise, she said. You'll always be our friends. As Richard hugged Elena back, he realized that helping her family had given him something much more valuable than any business deal ever had. It had given him the feeling that his life mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with making money. Richard started spending less time at his office and more time working on the housing program. He hired people to help run it properly, and he visited families who had been helped by the program to see how they were doing. Marcus noticed the change in his father right away. Richard seemed happier and more relaxed. He smiled more often, and he seemed more interested in having real conversations instead of just asking about homework and school. "Dad," Marcus said one day, "you seem different lately." "Different how?" Richard asked. "Happier," Marcus said. "Like you're doing something you really care about." Richard thought about this. "I think I am doing something I really care about." "Is it because of Elena?" Marcus asked. "Elena and Miguel and their mother taught me something important," Richard said. "They taught me that the best way to be happy is to help other people be happy." Marcus smiled. "I think Elena taught me that too." Richard realized that his son was learning lessons about kindness and generosity that Richard had never learned as a child. Marcus was growing up with a sense of responsibility toward other people that would stay with him for his whole life, and it had all started with a little girl sharing half of her sandwich. 6 months after that first day in the park, Richard stood in Elena's new bedroom watching her arrange books on a shelf that was all her own. The apartment was small but bright, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where Mrs. Rodriguez could cook family dinners, and a living room where Miguel could play with his toys without worrying about disturbing other families. "Look, Mr. Richard," Elena called out excitedly. "I have my own desk where I can do homework, and Miguel has his own toy box." Richard smiled as he watched Elena show off her new room. The happiness on her face was worth more to him than any amount of money he had ever made. Mrs. Rodriguez had been in their new apartment for 3 months now, and she was thriving. She had found a job teaching at a local elementary school, and Miguel was healthy and growing stronger every day. "How do you like your new school?" Richard asked Elena. "I love it," Elena said. "Mrs. Johnson says I'm one of the best readers in the class now. And guess what? I did skip ahead in math, just like Mrs. Rodriguez at the shelter said I could." Marcus, who was sitting on Elena's bed looking at one of her books, grinned at his friend. "Elena is really smart, Dad. She helps me with my math homework sometimes." Richard felt a warm feeling in his chest. The friendship between Marcus and Elena had grown stronger over the months. They had taught each other so much. Elena had taught Marcus about gratitude, generosity, and finding happiness even when life was difficult. Marcus had taught Elena about dreaming big and believing that good things could happen. But they had both taught Richard the most important lessons of all. Through the window of Elena's room, Richard could see the community garden he had helped create in the neighborhood. It was Elena's idea, actually. She had mentioned that she missed having fresh vegetables like the ones her grandmother used to grow before she died. Richard had worked with the city to turn an empty lot into a place where families could grow their own food. "Dad," Marcus said, "Mrs. Rodriguez made dinner for us. She says it's ready." They walked to the kitchen where Mrs. Rodriguez was putting food on the table. She had prepared Elena's favorite meal, rice and beans with fresh vegetables from the community garden. It was simple food, but it smelled wonderful and was made with love. "Thank you for having us for dinner, Maria," Richard said. Over the months, they had become real friends, and Richard no longer felt awkward around Elena's family. "Thank you for everything you've done for us," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Not just the apartment, but the friendship. Elena and Miguel talk about you and Marcus every day." As they sat around the table eating dinner together, Richard thought about how much his life had changed. He still ran his technology company, but he no longer worked 12 hours a day. He had hired good people to help him, and he had learned to trust them to make important decisions. Instead of spending all his time making more money, Richard now spent 3 days a week working on the housing program he had created. 25 families had moved from shelters into permanent housing through the program. But Richard had learned that the program was about much more than just housing. The program also provided job training for parents who needed new skills. It offered childcare so that parents could work or go to school. It connected families with healthcare, legal services, and financial counseling. Most importantly, it treated every family with dignity and respect, recognizing that people needed help because of bad luck, not bad choices. "Mr. Richard," Miguel said, tugging on Richard's sleeve. "Can you come see the picture I drew?" Richard followed the 4-year-old to his bedroom, where Miguel had covered the walls with colorful drawings. There were pictures of his family, pictures of animals, and pictures of the community garden. But the picture Miguel wanted to show him was special. "This is you and Marcus and Elena and me and Mama," Miguel explained, pointing to stick figures, holding hands. "We're all friends forever." Richard felt his throat get tight with emotion. "That's a beautiful picture, Miguel. Can I keep a copy of it?" "You can have this one," Miguel said generously. "I can make another one." Richard carefully took the drawing and knew he would treasure it always. It was worth more to him than any expensive artwork in his penthouse. Later that evening, as Richard and Marcus walked home through the neighborhood, they stopped by the community garden. Even though it was getting dark, there were still a few families there, watering plants and harvesting vegetables for dinner. "Dad," Marcus said, as they looked at the rows of growing plants, "remember when Elena shared her sandwich with me that first day?" "I remember," Richard said. "How could I forget?" "I think that's when everything changed," Marcus said thoughtfully. "Not just for us, but for Elena's family and all the other families we've helped." Richard nodded. "You're right. Elena taught us something very important that day." "What did she teach us?" Marcus asked, even though Richard knew his son already understood. "She taught us that sharing makes everything better," Richard said. "When you share what you have with someone else, both people end up happier." Marcus smiled. "And she taught us that being rich isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much you care about other people." Richard looked down at his son with pride. At 9 years old, Marcus understood things about life and happiness that Richard had taken 42 years to learn. "You know," Richard said, "when I was growing up, I thought that having a lot of money would make me happy. I thought that if I just made enough money, I would feel successful and satisfied." "Did it work?" Marcus asked. "No," Richard said honestly. "Having money made my life easier, but it didn't make me happy. I was lonely and empty inside, even though I had everything money could buy." "What makes you happy now?" Marcus asked. Richard thought about this question. "Spending time with you makes me happy. Helping Elena's family and the other families makes me happy. Seeing you and Elena learn and grow makes me happy. Working in the garden with our neighbors makes me happy." "So the best things don't cost money?" Marcus asked. "The best things can't be bought with money," Richard corrected gently. "Love, friendship, helping others, watching people succeed, those things are free. But they're the most valuable things in the world." As they walked home, Richard thought about how much his relationship with Marcus had improved. Instead of awkward, weekend visits filled with expensive activities, they now spent time together working on projects that mattered to both of them. They volunteered at the shelter every Saturday morning. They helped families move into new apartments. They worked in the community garden and organized events for children in the neighborhood. Most importantly, they talked to each other. Really, talked. Marcus told Richard about his dreams and worries, and Richard shared his own thoughts and feelings with his son. They had become true friends as well as father and son. Richard had also changed his relationship with Sarah, Marcus's mother. Instead of seeing her as someone who was keeping Marcus away from him, Richard now understood that Sarah wanted what was best for their son. They worked together to make sure Marcus felt loved and supported by both of his parents. "Dad," Marcus said as they reached their building, "do you think Elena knows how much she changed our lives?" "I think she knows that we're all friends," Richard said, "but I don't think she realizes that she taught us how to be better people." "Maybe we should tell her," Marcus suggested. "Maybe we should," Richard agreed. "But I think the best way to thank Elena is to keep doing what she taught us to do." "What's that?" Marcus asked. "Keep sharing what we have with people who need it," Richard said. "Keep treating everyone with kindness and respect. Keep believing that everyone deserves to be happy and safe." As they rode the elevator up to Richard's apartment, Richard felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction that he had never experienced before. His life had meaning and purpose now. He was using his wealth and resources to make the world a better place, and he was raising his son to understand that true success meant helping others succeed too. The next morning, Richard would go to his office for a few hours to handle important business decisions. Then he would spend the afternoon at the housing program, meeting with new families and working with his team to expand their services to help even more people. Marcus would spend the morning at school, where he was doing well in all his subjects and had made several new friends. After school, he would go to Elena's apartment to do homework with her and play with Miguel. Then the whole family would work together in the community garden, planting seeds that would grow into food for their neighbors. It was a simple life. In many ways, much simpler than the complicated, expensive life Richard used to live. But it was also a richer life, full of meaningful relationships and work that made a real difference in the world. And it had all started with a homeless 9-year-old girl who had been willing to share half of her sandwich with a boy she had just met, teaching a billionaire father that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought with money, but could only be found through love, generosity, and caring for others.